Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today we're going to talk about a controversial topic in the world of bass fishing. No, it's not forward-facing sonar related, and no, it's not which professional bass league is better. It has to do with these guys right here, hook gap. Which is the appropriate hook gap to choose when fishing soft plastics? This is something that I have found out to be very controversial with respect to anglers. Some anglers say you got to go with an extra wide gap. Some anglers say you can go with a standard gap, standard worm hook. But the reality is a lot of anglers out there are really hot when it comes to choosing which one is right. And the reason I know that is because Core Tackle came out with the Ozark rig. And the Ozark rig, we used a traditional jig hook in this. So we don't have an extra wide gap hook. We've got a standard jig hook. This is a 4/0 size hook, the same hook that would come in, you know, whatever jig that you buy. It's a standard jig hook. Well, we've had some comments where people are requesting that we make it in a wide gap hook. And that's something that we've discussed and we probably will do down the road. And that's simply because if you use a bait that is a large bait or a very thick bodied bait, what happens is you can close that gap in. Now in this case, this is a 4-inch Pit Boss, 4/0 hook. There's plenty of gap there. In my opinion, what you're looking for is a gap that will eat up your plastic bait. So in this case, this gap is about a 1/2 inch. It is at least the same width of the bait. So when that fish bites and that bait gets pushed down, you've got the same gap that you would have, you know, if you basically threaded that jig or that plastic onto the jig hook. There is plenty of gap there. There's easily a 1/2 inch of gap. But if you were to put an oversized plastic, and if that bait filled up that entire gap and only pushed down to say that far, you're gonna miss some fish. Now this is why I want to argue though that hook gap is overrated. The reality is you don't need a huge amount of gap for two reasons. One, all you need is that hook point to catch and hook the fish. If you've got just a hair of it exposed, that's all you need to really drive that home. There are times, sure, where I'd say your plastic bait is too thick, and from that standpoint, it might impede the hook set. But in reality, all you need is enough for that hook point to catch somewhere on the fish, and you're going to drive it home. The issue really comes where if your bait is too thick and your plastic can't squeeze down, you actually have pressure from the plastic pushing on the fish's mouth, preventing that hook point from potentially penetrating. But if you've got, I'm gonna say anywhere from probably a 1/4 inch all the way down to the 1/2 inch, you've got plenty of hook point there. There is plenty sticking out. Now this is the reason why I'm gonna say, more importantly, that less hook gap is generally better. It has to do with performance of your bait. The bigger the hook you put in, the more that's going to affect the actual movement and presentation of your bait. So, you know, one reason we've got two of the most popular hooks to choose from, which is your standard offset worm hook and then your offset extra wide gap hook, meaning they actually bend the hook shank out further, as you can see, to increase that gap, is simply for the need to move bigger baits on your plastic. So the standard worm hook really came out and shined really well. This is just the standard offset worm hook. So you don't see the increased gap here. That was because most of the plastic worms that we were throwing back in the day were plenty big, or small I should say, for this hook. Meaning if you put an 8-inch Berkeley Power Worm, the #1 worm on the market, it would easily have plenty of gap here. Well, when we started coming out with bigger creature baits, say a big brush hog or something along those lines, there's a lot more plastic there. And that's where the idea to increase this gap really came. You know, if you increase the gap, the bait can push back more and it exposes more of the hook point. So it really does come into play. But if you go with a little bit bigger, heavier hook and you're still using, say, a worm or a smaller plastic or a skinnier plastic, that hook does add more weight. It does potentially stick out further, so it can impede the action of your bait. I would also argue that generally, in my opinion, the bigger the hook you go, the more that hook sticks out of the presentation and the more that the fish can potentially hone in on that hook. I'm one where I would rather go with a smaller hook versus a bigger hook, because I do think you get a little bit better action, a little bit better natural fall, generally speaking, if you're using a smaller hook. But I tend to think that I get more bites, and I know a lot of people are going to argue with me, but if I can get away with a 3/0 hook versus a 4/0 hook, or a 4/0 hook versus a 5/0 hook, and I can do it in a standard wire hook versus, say, a heavy duty, extra heavy hook, I tend to get more bites. I really do firmly believe that, and I don't have an issue hooking those fish. Now, granted, if the gap is too small, you need to go with a bigger hook. But if you can get away with a standard hook, I highly recommend doing it, because I think you're going to find that you'll get more bites and you'll get a better presentation out of your bait. That's my personal preference. Now, I do definitely think there are plenty of times to go with a wide gap hook, specifically with your bigger, bulkier plastics. But in most cases, with most plastics, I don't personally think it's necessary. So I want to know from you guys what your opinion is. I think hook gap is overrated. It's important with some baits, but not most baits. So let me know in the comments section, what are your thoughts on hook gap? And am I barking down the wrong tree here, where I feel like I'm gonna have a lot of people that are gonna say gap is 100% the most critical thing when it comes to hook up percentages? I don't personally feel that way. Otherwise, I think you'd see more baits come with bigger hook gaps on everything, from treble hooks to flipping jigs to, you know, you name it, your vibrating jigs. And the reality is most of those do come in certain versions that have bigger wide gap hooks on them, but they're not necessarily a top seller when you talk about those specific baits. Anyways, it's my opinion. I'd love to hear what your opinion is as well. So thanks for watching, guys. I appreciate all of you. Stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.